Hi there. It's good to see you back and to be able to share with you a reflection from Luke chapter 1. I wonder if you have ever had anything strange happen to you in your life that reminds you that there is more to life than you realise. Something happened to me and my wife on Hogmanay in 1987. We were expecting our first child and we were involved in an accident with no other cars as I braked going round a blind corner, seeing to my shock a boy running across the road, and I had braked sufficiently for that, but then another boy decides to run across the road to join his friend, and then I had to brake harder, and it locked the wheel and I spun off the road and I hit a railway bridge wall and came to a halt. No one else was hurt, thankfully, but there was both concern in us about the baby and the pressing of the seatbelt, and it was hard to tell to see what had happened. And we phoned an on-call doctor who wasn't really helpful on this occasion and came off the phone, neither is feeling better about the situation. We just knew the baby was still, and we decided to pray. And I laid my hand on Ruth's tummy and asked for guidance and help. No sooner I had said amen, the baby gave this almighty big kick right where my hand was placed. We just took that as a clear sign that the baby was safe. But that moment ever since has spoken to both of us about how God can speak into our lives in our daily circumstance. For us, it was an unusual event, but the impact of that memory has lasted throughout the years and made us much more sensitive to how God is with us. Mary had something strange happen to her, but it's not what we might have thought in the story that we've read. When we read this story today of her encounter with this angel, Mary would know that she would be marrying into a famous lineage, with Joseph being a descendant of King David. He would have the weight on his shoulders of all the baggage of how important that legacy of King David would be for a nation. And when Mary was told by an angel in our story of a new, far-reaching vision for King David's kingdom that was in her lifetime, then the words of the angel would sound like echoes from that deep caverns of an ancient, unrecognisable past. When Mary asked then, how can this be? I'm only a virgin. She was not asking some scientific question about whether this news of a child to be was possible or not. She was trying to work out how in her circumstances, how can God show through that and through her life that love wins. It's not just to do with Mary falling pregnant before her marriage to Joseph. There was something else. I wonder at the time of Mary if the line of King David still held some sway in the time as it was in King David's reign. I wonder what people's response would be to such a new, far-reaching promise from an angel when the descendants of King David were suppressed by Romans, walking about as if it was their land. There wasn't even a faint shadow of King David's kingdom left. Israel in Mary's day was like a political prune, all shriveled up and the ambitions crushed by a mighty empire. I can just begin to imagine what was behind Mary's question. How can this be? Mary's willingness to even be open to the possibilities seems to stem from a persistent tradition in those songwriters that feature in that stubborn refusal to never let go of the belief that God wins. For instance, in our psalm today that we've got for our worship, it was written when God's people were in exile away from Israel. Despite the state of such a depleted nation, one thing is not lost to them. They have a kernel of hope and a seed of love that's still buried deep in the writer's spiritual inner being. They were saying God's steadfast love and faithfulness never fails. It's just not just acknowledged, but celebrated. And it's not an isolated incident either. It seems as if these writers were not overcome by adversity after years of what seemed abandonment. This is not a solo piece, but a chorus. God's steadfast love is mentioned also in Psalm 100. It says, "For the Lord is good, his steadfast love endures forever." In Psalm 103, the psalmist says again, "The steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting." Similarly, in the book of Lamentations, we read, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercy never comes to an end." God's steadfast love and faithfulness is again emphasized here in the words of the angel to Mary. And Mary was wondering, how can this be? In the face of these big problems in her world, how was love going to come through? But that was not the whole sentence. How can this be? I'm a virgin. That's what Mary said. Again, this is not a scientific question or a biology lesson. It was saying, how can love win when the conventions and traditions of my world will not accept me for who I am? When all that could ever come from this is rejection and shame. Now, if we get hung up on the part of the story that Mary is a virgin, we're going to miss the point. The issue, the pending response, is the issue here to this news. The point is, how is love to win and find a way through? Will this stop God's unshakable, steadfast love and God's unconditional, unalterable faithfulness? As we read in the passage as well, for there is nothing that God cannot do. So if we look at Mary's response, not just speaking about the impossible world of a rising new kingdom in the face of an oppressive Roman Empire, where she's told love will conquer all, but also how will her predicament be resolved in her own community to break down the prejudices that does not set love free. We need to filter out from our story that scientific perspective and wonder more how love wins through Mary's predicament. How will a single mother be instrumental so love wins when there is every prospect that she would be rejected and even disgraced for bringing shame on such a regal lineage of Joseph, the son of a King David? Maybe we've been overcome recently too by the problems of this world out there and wondering, how does love win in these circumstances? Maybe we have had to face issues in our own lives or in our neighbourhood or within the church, and we wonder, how can love win through these? It is the same for us today. How will love win as we manage to find a way through our mess, our brokenness and disappointment, hurt and sorrow and regret and doubt and pain? How can we draw closer to believing, for there's nothing that God cannot do? Therefore, the challenge from this story is if we believe that love wins in our own circumstances. That's the true test. The issue of this passage is not to sort out that science or biology. It's more about how our faith trusts God to work in and through our lives. Could we join with the tradition of those songwriters in the Psalms that say love wins? That the steadfast love of God never ceases? His mercies will never come to an end? How was Mary able to process this? Well, two steps in our faith, from our story at least, that can take us closer to that. First is her openness. We see in Mary that there is an openness to God. She was well aware of God working through King David, and that her husband-to-be was all part of that. But God had worked in the past, so God will work in her life now. God had promised he would work in the future, and that meant for her now. So God is not stopping now or bypassing us. We need to remain open. What does that look like for us? So we are still a believer that love still wins. Have we avoided God speaking into our lives? Have we limited our minds of what God can do? Have our hearts hardened that it's harder to be open? This story is a challenge to change that today. Will we? The second step from our story is that Mary was not alone. The story tells us of her companionship with Elizabeth, her cousin. God let her know other things are happening in other people's lives. What that tells us is that we're not alone either. God works through other people's lives too. And what can that look like? We just need to learn to share. And this should be one reason why it's good to gather. And when we can gather, we share our stories, and stories that are living out now, and we don't know what the ending will be. But hearing stories can happen in the strangest of places. I was only reading this week in the BBC News on my phone about a guy called Pastor Mick Fleming and another person called Father Alex Frost. And they were on the BBC and they were feeding and clothing the poor in Burnley, and many were moved by the work as they were watching this on TV. And since then, as far as I'm aware, they've raised well over 250,000 in donations. But you see, this guy Mick's life wasn't always about love and care. He was once a dangerous, violent drug user and dealer, covering up painful childhood memories until a single moment changed everything. You see, this guy, Mick Fleming, in his late 30s, was waiting outside a gym for someone to emerge. Mick was in a stolen car, a dark blue Vauxhall Cavalier with the engine running. This was going to have to be a quick operation for him. There was no sun, it was a dull, dark day, and he knew this guy's routine. And everything about this guy Mick knew told him that he was another drug dealer, just like himself at that point in his life. He had his gun in a plastic carrier bag on the passenger seat, wrapped tight. He could see the shape of the gun, so there was no DNA prints on this to be left behind. 6 bullets, spring-loaded. It would never fail. He didn't have to wait long, and he watched and he saw this person come out the gym, but this time it was different. He had 2 kids with him, 2 young children, blonde girls around 5 years old, and he got out the car and walked, and he was reaching into the plastic bag, but then looked again at the children and their faces and their blonde hair and innocence. And then it happened for Mick. And he describes this situation of a blinding light coming from one of the children's hands. It was white, a brilliant white, he says. And for 15 seconds, he couldn't see a thing. It was like looking into the sun, and he was paralysed by it. And Mick didn't know what really happened that day. But one thing he's certain of, it was that moment that changed his life forever. And he collapsed, struggling back to the car. He was sick, shaking, sweating, heart beating, and he could hear the pulse in his head. He didn't know what was happening to him. And then he says he pleaded with God to help him. Nothing happened. And the only thing piercing the silence, he says, was that Johnny Cash was playing on the radio. The song was Man in Black. And he heard the words, "I wear the black and mourning for the lies that could have been." He felt like he was the man in black. And by this point in his life, he had been arrested for attempted murder, kidnapping, firearms offences. He'd wanted to die. He'd had enough. Mick took that gun, pressed it to his chin, still wrapped in that plastic bag, and pulled the trigger. It didn't fire. And he broke down. Tears did not stop. And he started to feel sick and retching, and punched and smashed the car radio, and his hands started to bleed. And in that moment, he was seeing himself for who he really was. He hadn't cried for over 30 years. The last time he cried like this was when he was 11 years old. And sitting in the car, it was like him crying for that child, that boy, the life he could have had. Mick was suffering from a complete breakdown. His violent past catching up with him. Decades of pain. Now, he wasn't brought up in poverty, but neither was it luxury. It was a strict upbringing. He did go to church. He didn't step out of line. It was that kind of old school discipline. But everything changed over a period of 2 days in February 1977. On the first day of that month, Mick was attacked by a stranger in a park on the way back from school. He was only 11 years old. He was in turmoil. He'd been sexually abused and he couldn't cope. He realised he needed help, and he needed to tell his mum and dad. So he walked out of his room where he'd been crying, went downstairs and looked his mum straight in the eye. But even before that even happened, the door opened, the front door, and his dad shouted, "Your sister is dead." Brutal, direct, and he remembers the moment with pure silence that pierced by screams from his mother, howling. You see, that was the moment, he says, his childhood ended. Life disfigured in 48 hours. And so drugs became his solution. 30 years of what he called hell. And he used them. It became the basis of his criminality. And his criminality helped him to have his drugs. At the young age of 14, he was dealing in drugs. And people knew who he was. He was a drug runner, a debt collector. He hurt people, and yet he wasn't bothered. He'd been arrested for murder twice, armed robbery 3 times, countless firearm offences. It was kind of crazy money that was going on. Even attempts on his life. Drugs constantly around him. It was destroying him. He said he believed in God even during this time, but he believed God didn't think much of him. He was now a very dangerous man, collecting debts, hurting people, never expecting to live long. He didn't know how to change. And it was in that time in 2009 when he found himself outside the gym, where he sat in the car, cried out for God for help. That attempt to take his own life, it triggered a meltdown where there was an intervention by the authorities, and within 24 hours he was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. His new home was the Burnley Psychiatric Unit. He arrived there with the clothes he was in. And it was there he met someone called Pastor Tony, who visited him in the unit. And they prayed and talked and began to sense his emotions again. He started helping others. And that was the end of a troubled life. And he began having a new one of hope. There was a chance meeting where he then was able to take up a degree, and while he may have struggled with writing because of dyslexia and dyspraxia, failing in his exams, but then through support of the university, he eventually got his degree. He never touched drink or drugs again. It wasn't easy and it was horrendous, but his path has taken him right now into 2020 and through this pandemic, and he has been able to provide support to others overwhelmed by suffering and pain. See, Pastor Mick, who was once a drug dealer, is now a pastor in a charity with it's called the Church on the Street Ministries. And it's in Burnley. And it's there that he was there to support people who are drug users, homeless and the hungry. And during this pandemic, he has seen so much need and he has responded. And this is the thing. Pastor Mick had his own Damascus Road experience. A life of crime that was changed to a life of hope. And this is his own words. He said, "What I do today, it's not a penance. It is the complete opposite. It's a privilege to serve the people of Burnley. It's a glorious thing." What a place to reach, and a way that he has moved from those terrible events in his own childhood. Even more remarkable, 10 years ago, he befriended a homeless alcoholic outside a takeaway. Mick listened to him and cared for him, helped him to get sober and reunite with his family. That man died 2 years later, but his family were thankful that they could be together. What he never told that man, or the family, or the police, was that was the man who sexually assaulted him as a child when he was 11. Why? Well, he knew that he had been forgiven for his past. He knew that what had happened had been done, those terrible things, but he felt forgiven and he didn't want to live that life anymore. He was free and he wanted this person to be free. And do you know what he says? He says, "I'm not spending my life anymore in torment. It's redemption." What a story. And maybe we need to be open to God and realise you're not on your own. God is working in other people's lives too. And we need to go through this life together. I hope and pray that you, in this lead up to Christmas, have that moment that could change the rest of your life, because God has been there and working in and through you, where love wins.